Good day, everyone. Today we're going to tackle the international institutions. I know for sure some of you here knew at least two or more of them. So, before anything, let's explore first how these international institutions were established. So, historically, on July 1, 1944, as the battles of the Second World War raged in Europe and Pacific, delegates from 44 nations met at the secluded Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to participate in what became known as the Bretton Woods Conference. Their purpose was to agree on a system of economic order and international cooperation that would help countries recover from devastation of the war and foster a long-term global growth. As its conclusion, the conference attendees produced the Article of Agreement for the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development and the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so we will start by knowing who are the major players of this topic. So, in a post war context, it is stated here that this conference at Bretton Woods, representing nearly all the peoples of the world, has considered matters of international money and finance, which are important for peace and prosperity. The conference has agreed on the problems needing attention, the measure which should be taken, and the forms of international cooperation or organization which are required. The agreements are reached on these large and complex matters are without precedent in the history and international economic relations. So, July 22, 1944 is the economic relations. It is where the final act of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which included charters outlining the goals and mechanisms of both the IMF and IBRD, were signed by the delegates. Next, we have the crisis, the oil crisis specifically. So first, we have the dramatic rise in debt among poorer countries 1970s and 1980s. So the decades of the 1970s began with the unexpected global economic turmoil after a long stretch of economic stability and robust growth in the earlier post-war period. There were two oil price shocks and the persistence of high inflation and unemployment, referred to as stagflation, in several developed countries. As a result, a difficult global economic situation confronted the world as it entered the 1980s, a situation characterized by both internal and external imbalances. High inflation and unemployment in developed countries and large deficits in current account of the balance of payments in both developed and developing countries such as Latin America and Africa. So, given the struggle and crisis faced by all nations, some nations made some effort to help other nations to recover. But before that, the crisis was transmitted primarily by the trade and financial flows, forcing millions back into poverty. Attainment of the Millennium Development Goal is seriously jeopardized in many countries. Many developing countries did not and do not have the resources to stimulate the economy and protect their socially disadvantaged populations to the same extent as the industrialized countries. However, many countries have made considerable efforts to mitigate the effects. Developing countries have also increased their cooperation with one another and are urgently demanding a greater voice in global economic affairs. So, as crisis lash out most of the countries, especially the poor or those countries experiencing heavy poverty, the emergence of poverty reduction was the prime objective of international financial institutions. So, for many years, drawn the attention of the international community to the end to address the plight of the poorest and the least developed countries, the active advocacy role played by civil society has been a major factor in bringing the question of poverty and its linkages with the globalization process into sharper focus. Next is, oh, okay, we have a question here. So, which institution have you heard of that might be involved in health policy formulation, health financing, health service delivery, etc.? Okay, so challenge yourself. You can pause the video and you can comment your answer before we proceed to the next slide. Okay, so I guess you all are familiar of these international organizations on the list. So first we have the most popular one, which is the World Health, followed by the NGO, then International Monetary Bank, World Trade Organization, Public-Private Partnership, and National Government. So World Health Organization is the UN specialized agency for health. It was established on April 7, 1948, and their objective is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. It is governed by 192 member states through the World Health Assembly. And World Health Assembly is where representatives of WHO assemble, and their main tasks are to approve the WHO program and the budget for the following biennium and to decide major policy questions. Next is the strength of WHO. So first is specialized knowledge, then proven success record, and they're also democratic, consultative when it comes to the decision-making process. Also, they have weaknesses, which first in the list is that they are bureaucratic. They also usually face crisis just like the COVID pandemic, and they might be also influenced by large funders. Next is we have the World Bank. So World Bank's mission is to fight poverty and improve the living standards of the people in developing world. Provides loans, policy advice, technical assistance, and knowledge sharing services to low and middle income countries to reduce poverty. They also promote growth to create jobs and to empower poor people to take advantage of the opportunities. World Bank is also composed of 184 countries jointly responsible for how the institution is financed and how its money is spent. It also says here that some 10,000 development professionals from nearly every country in the world work in the World Bank's Washington, D.C. headquarters or in its 109 country offices. Lastly, World Bank centers its efforts on the reaching of the Millennium Development Goals agreed to by the United Nations member in 2000 and aim at sustainable poverty reduction. So, 4 years that World Bank has been serving its purpose, it accumulated total of $25 billion dollars for development lending, 199 HNP projects in 84 countries, and 9.5 billion on other assets. So, strengths of WB or World Bank are they are well funded, powerful, and now spends more on health than the World Health Organization do. Their weaknesses is that they overemphasis on economic growth that led into trouble, transparency, and accountability. Next, we have the IMF or International Monetary Fund. So if you catch up earlier, IMF was conceived at Bretton Woods on July 1944. So the 45 governments, those who signed the Article of Agreement, represented sought to build a framework for economic cooperation that would avoid a repetition of the policies that contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s. IMF is also composed of 184 member countries, and their aim is to promote international monetary cooperation, exchange stability, and orderly exchange arrangements. They also foster economic growth and high levels of employment and provide temporary financial assistance to countries to help ease balance of payments and payments adjustments. So extensively, they have approximately 2,700 staff from 141 countries, total quotas counting to $311 billion, and loans outstanding $97 billion to 84 countries, of which $10 billion to 59 on concessional terms. Technical assistance provided 367 person years during year of 2004. Surveillance consultations concluded 116 countries during 2004, of which 92 voluntarily published their staff reports. Next is World Trade Organizations or WTO. So national health policies are increasingly influenced by trade agreements of the World Trade Organization. The General Agreement on Trade and Services is the World Trade Organization's treaty that covers health services. So question is, what is the World Trade Organization? Okay, so World Trade Organization was established on 1995 with 148 country members. They were also formed from GATT, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Its main function stated that the only international organization dealing with global rules of trade between nations. Its main function is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. So how does World Trade Organization work? First is through a set of treaties. So these treaties contain binding rules. They also work as trade court to punish infringements. Treaties made are also combined to prevent evasion of free trade promises, and they also monitor the countries in periodic trade reviews. Moving to criticisms of the World Trade Organization, first is that they reduce national autonomy by forcing marketization of public services, undermining viability of public services by preventing cross-subsidization, outlawing monopoly provision, and putting limits on public health actions by testing their necessity. However, World Trade Organization has its recognized merits. They have the right to regulate. Their public services are not covered. The treaty does not require privatizations. Members choose what to liberalize, and members can qualify liberalizations promises in order to protect public policy objectives. So, very unlikely to World Health Organization. Next on the list is the national government. So example of national government is US aid. In terms of percentage of their GNP is already lowest of any industrialized nation in the world. Though paradoxically, in the last 3 years, their dollar amount has been the highest, well, even up until these days. So in the past, Japan was the largest donor of aid in terms of raw dollars, but to US hegemony, Japan's aid dropped by nearly $4 billion in 2001. Next is the NGO, or non-governmental organizations. So their function is mostly on emergency or crisis. Best example here is the most well-known, the International Committee of Red Cross. Then they are for development. Example is Oxfam. So Oxfam is a global movement of people working together to end the injustice of poverty. Lastly, their focus is the vulnerable populations, which aim to save the children. So for the strength of NGO, they are closer linked to civil society, and they have specialized areas of expertise. While their weaknesses are uncertain funding, they can also be influenced by funders like WHO. And not all NGOs are grassroots organizations. Some are equivalent to multinational corporations. Lastly, we have the PPP, or public-private partnerships. So they are relatively new in the area of global health policy, and the biggest player are Gavi and the Global Fund. Strengths of PPP are they are well funded and efficient. Streamlined system often make for faster decision making. While for their weaknesses, mostly focus on accountability, then conflict of interest, and transparency. Next, we have the increasing cooperation. As years pass and the world keep changing and evolving, there is a need for increasing cooperation in all nations and countries. First is globalization, which means as a force changing of the world. Then UN Conference on Trade and Development, World Bank's health policy model, and growing role influence of PPPs. Next is policy networks levers, the poverty reduction strategy paper and sector-wide approach. Then criticism. Following criticisms are the network is a policy elite, not a scientific response. Limits the attentions to social costs of ill health and local control is questioned. Next is the example joint policy management. Highly in-depth for countries, international development associations, health, nutrition, and population and donor aid. Then the effects of coordination are help put on the development agenda, coordinating policy management, concept of multilateral policy, change and challenge to health for all. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for having me and you today.